Let me do it the other way around. Now we'll share my screen. Okay, guys. So let's talk a little bit about what this concept of sockets means. So far in your time in the boot camp, we've been dealing with this HTTP request and response cycle. And which side of things always initiates the request? Is it the server side or the client side? Always the client. Yeah, exactly. So far in what we've been doing, it's always been the client that starts that little communication. But what we're going to do today is when we talk about sockets, that communication can actually be initiated by the server side as well. So where this comes into play is just kind of a simple example. What if I had some sort of an eBay-ish type of application where people can bid on something? Well, for anybody who's connected to that application and is looking at a particular item, I also want to alert that person in some way that the bid price of this item has gone up, right? Because if they're seeing a page that shows an outdated bid and then they try to beat that bid, well, of course, it's not real time. So they're bidding against something that's stale. So instead, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to communicate that fact to all the people that are connected to our application at any given point in time. We want to alert what they're seeing on their screen in a way to show them that what is the current bid for that item. Okay, now that's one example. Obviously, there are many other different types of examples, like if you were building an application where you wanted people to be able to buy plane tickets or something like that, and the plane ticket prices are constantly being updated. You'd want to show them the most updated price at any given point in time. Otherwise, they may try to purchase something that they could no longer purchase. Or like a ticketing app for an event or something like that, right? All right. So conceptually, does anybody have any questions about what we're talking about here before I get into the more nitty-gritty part of it? Thumbs on this? On why we would use sockets? Yeah? Up, up, up? Good. All right, cool. So let's actually get into the code part of this. Let me set the chat over here. Okay, and I'm just going to create a new folder. So we'll say make dir sockets demo code sockets demo. Okay. Sorry, things are a little sluggish here on the computer since there's a lot going on. Okay. Whoa. Got the spinning wheel of death too. All right. So I got my terminal open here. I'm going to want to install some things as usual, right? But I also want to create a server folder because I am still going to want to have this be a full stack application. We will still have a server side and a client side. So I'll create my server folder here. And then inside that server folder, I know that I'm going to have my actual server.js, right? Okay, cool. Let me navigate into that folder. Oh boy, let me get this out of here. Later. Okay, now I'm going to want to install my dependencies. Which dependencies do you think that we'll need? Anybody? Express. Yeah, let's install Express. And we're going to need socket.io. Very well done. So let's say npm I express and then socket.io. Is this going to create my package.json for me? Has anyone experimented with that? Hey, it did. Oh, it created my package-log. Okay, hang on 1 second. So let me just do npm init -y. That will create the package.json, and then I'll reinstall those guys. I should have initialized first. My bad. All right, cool. So while that's installing, let's go ahead and get this set up. We want to require express as usual, right? Albert's saying npm and sit init inside server folder. Have I been doing it wrong this entire time? Well, you know, as usual, there are different ways of doing things, but we're kind of trying to segment our projects into sort of two different sides. So we've got like a server side and a client side. So that's why I'm going into my server folder before I install those two things. Okay. All right, so let's require express, right? Sometimes that doesn't work. Don't know why. Okay, and then normally in here we would probably have some middleware that we were attaching, like app.use, express.json and such. But here we're not going to be making regular HTTP requests, so things are going to be a little bit different. I do want to listen though once I create my app. So let's say app express. Okay, and normally we would just do something like this. We'd say app.listen or whatever, 4,000. However, things are going to be slightly different here. Now we're actually going to want to require our socket.io. Okay, so we'll say IO. Actually, we'll do the require down here. Hang on 1 second. Instead of just saying app.listen, I'm actually going to set a variable equal to this. So we'll say const server equals app.listen. So now I have a reference to this app that is listening on port 4000, right? Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up another variable here called IO. And I'm going to set that to the result of requiring socket.io. And what's requiring socket.io is going to return me is going to be a function in much a similar way to how requiring express gives us a function that we can call, right? So when I get that function that I'm requiring from here, I'm going to invoke that against my server. Okay. Now I've got this variable called IO. IO is a variable that I can actually attach event listeners to. So I can say something like IO.on, and I could say on a connection event. So what this means is that when a client has connected to my server side, I can run some code at that point, right? So I'm going to create something out here. I'm just going to create a variable called connected clients, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. Okay. So now when this connection event takes place, I want to increment this number right here. I want to say, okay, now I have 1 connected client, and then when another person connects, I want to bump that up to 2 and so forth. Okay, so what do we think that the second argument of the on method takes in? If you had to guess. Yeah, callback function, right? Our favorite. So let's create this callback. The callback function is going to be given a reference to something called a socket. Okay, and we could think of that as this is a reference to the actual client that has connected to us. And let's do maybe a couple things. We'll just console.log the socket. And then we're going to increment this plus plus. And then I'm just going to log out here. We have, and then I'll put the number here, connected clients connected. Okay. Hopefully you guys are feeling fairly confident about this. All we're doing is we're creating a function here that takes in a socket. We're going to console log that socket, and we'll actually find that the socket's going to be a really huge object. We're going to increment the number of clients that we have connected, and then we're just going to console log we have this many clients connected. Okay, so pretty straightforward, pretty simple. All right, any questions about this before we kind of move to the client side part of it? No? Cool. Let me create another, darn it. I always have trouble like getting stuff out of the way here. Move this down. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another terminal, and this is where we're going to do our client stuff. So I'm going to create a React app. Client. There we go. All right, and while we're kind of waiting for that, I'll just have this up and running so you guys can kind of see what was there. All right, is this done? Cool. We've got our client set. Let's go inside here. So before I actually get my client running, I'm going to install something that we need. And I saw this earlier, I think, oh shoot, it's still not done. Darn it. Wow. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but it seems like with everyone home all the time, maybe the internet's a bit more sluggish. Yeah, kind of sucky, right? Ah, and I can't really do anything in my client either because it's being created for me. Oh boy. What a tease. Who, me or create React app? Like, who's teasing here? Oh, create React app, yeah. Oh, come on, finish up already. Wow. Well, I guess we can always create a React app from scratch if we want to get into some Webpack stuff. All right, here we go. Looks like we're almost done. Oh man. Prativa has left the beach. Come back, Prativa. It's so peaceful there. She fell asleep. Oh my gosh. Sorry I didn't do this earlier. I should have just gotten this client installing while we were doing our server stuff. Didn't occur to me that it was going to take 5 minutes. Woo! Happy hacking. Woo! We got the go ahead. Sweet. All right. So now let's actually CD into our client. And I need to install one more package. And I saw Albert had mentioned this earlier. We want to install socket.io-client. Okay. This is for our client side. All right, and fortunately, we don't have to wait for that one to finish. We can actually start getting into the source stuff. So I'm going to go into my app.js. And as we've been doing a lot here, shoot, let me close out my terminal here. There we go. So as we've typically been doing, I can delete most of the stuff that's inside of here. Okay. Delete this logo, we don't need that. And then the other thing that we're going to need is we're probably going to be tracking some state here, right? Because there are going to be some things that change. Use. Actually, I'm also going to bring in use effect. Okay. So we've got those two things. So inside here, this is where the some of the magic is going to happen. So I'm going to create my socket on the client side. So I'm going to say const socket equals use state. And we're going to pass something to use state. Now, I've seen this error a little bit here and there with you guys, is that sometimes if I invoke this with nothing, what is the value of socket going to be? Yeah, undefined, exactly. So if you guys are doing this with an input value or something like that, you're going to get a warning in there telling you that you're turning something from a uncontrolled component into a controlled component. And it's because you initialize that piece of state to undefined by not passing any arguments in there. Okay? All right. So what we're going to need is we're going to need to actually import a function that the socket client gives us. Okay, so I'm going to say import IO, and we're going to import that from socket.io-client. Okay, can everyone tell me where this is coming from on line 3? Some signs of life out there. Modules, yes. Specifically, it's coming from our node modules in the client folder, right? Good. All right, so you might think that we could just invoke this IO function inside here. So by the way, we're going to invoke it with whatever the port number is of where we're running our server. So in our case, we're running it on port 4000. However, we can't do it this way. And the reason why is because every time our component re-renders, it's going to come back through this code starting from line 6 and go all the way down to the end of the return statement. So if I make some kind of other state change in my component, it's going to cause it to re-render, and it's also going to rerun this function, meaning that it's going to create a brand new socket every single time the component re-renders. And that's not good, because we only want one socket per client. Okay? So the way that we can get around this is, instead of passing a value to use state, which this is going to return us a value right now, we can also pass a callback function. Okay? And when we pass useState a callback function, it will only invoke that callback function the first time this component renders. Okay? So it will invoke this the first time, and then every other time it re-renders, we'll just be looking at the same exact socket that we created the first time. Any questions about that? Can you repeat again, please? Sure. Okay, so let's pretend like we didn't pass in a callback function. Let's say that we just invoked it directly. So the IO function is going to return me a socket. So initially that's going to look like it's working as expected. We'll create a socket. However, if I have any other state or anything else that changes in this component, the component is going to be forced to re-render, which means that we're going to come right back up to line 6 and start running all of our code, which means that this is going to get invoked again. Every single time the component re-renders, it's going to re-invoke that IO function, which means I'm going to create a new socket every time. So to get around that, what we do is we pass a callback function, and the way that React useState is set up, it will only invoke that callback function the first time the component renders. Okay? All right. Now the other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to call useEffect. Okay, you guys remember what we typically use useEffect for? Oh yeah, Axios. Okay, cool. But sort of on a get API calls, yeah. On a higher level than either of those two things, what were we sort of trying to simulate? Do you guys remember? Basic update page, okay. Remember, yeah, loading page. Okay, now you're getting warmer. So if you guys remember from when we were doing class components, we were trying to simulate this lifecycle method called component did mount. So in other words, I want to do something once the component first loads up, but only that one time, right? Okay. So we're going to pass this callback function here. And you can either pass in an empty array, that would work, but React is probably going to warn you because I'm going to use the socket inside here. So you could also, I think passing in the socket would probably work as well. We'll try it and just make sure that we don't run into any problems. Basically, we're saying when the socket ever changes, then we'll run this callback function. But the socket should never change, right? It's always going to be the same one. Okay? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event listener to the socket. So I'm going to say socket.on, and we'll call it new client. Or let's just call it welcome. It's probably a little better. Okay. When a welcome event happens, what I want to do is I want to console log whatever I got along with that event. So whenever we're sending events from the server to the client or the client to the server, we can also pass along some data. And this callback function is going to allow me to just log out whatever data I'm getting from the server. Is welcome arbitrary? Yeah, it is kind of arbitrary, but it will have to match back on our server side. Good question. Okay. Why is this telling us that socket is declared, but its value is never read? That's kind of weird. It is being read, right? All right. One other thing that we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to kind of clean up after ourselves. And there's a little bit more information about this in the platform as well. But if we return a function, a callback function from our useEffect, this will be run whenever this component gets unmounted. Okay? So at the end, I can say socket.disconnect. Oops. Now it's not super important to have that if we're having all of this stuff happen at the app level, because this is the top level component, right? This is never going to be, it's never going to not be mounted. It won't be unmounted. But if you're doing your socket stuff inside some sort of inner component, this part will be important, because otherwise your socket will never get disconnected when that component gets unmounted. Any questions about that? You can think of this as we're sort of cleaning up after ourselves so that our application doesn't start developing a memory leak. All right, so let me save that. And then back on the server side, let's do something else after we log that we have this many connected clients. I'm going to say socket.emit. And this means I want to send something back to the very same socket that just connected to me. Emit, welcome. And then I'm going to pass a string along with this. So thanks for coming. Okay. So again, what we're doing is we're welcoming that individual socket that just connected to us. How it is communicating with the client. Yeah, through this emit method on browser. So there's something going on behind the scenes. So this concept of WebSockets exists in browsers, and it's a different protocol. So like, rather than, normally we're doing things over either HTTP or HTTPS, there's a different protocol called WS. That's the protocol through which WebSockets are running. Okay, so this is something that's native to browsers. Now, socket.io is a particular, it's technically not an implementation of WebSockets, because we're able to pass all of this extra data along with our socket events. But basically any of the other languages that you guys have been working in, like Python, I think has an implementation of sockets called channels, if I remember correctly. I think Java has an implementation of it as well. Okay, so those things are enabling us to communicate through this WS protocol. Yeah. Well, I mean, that would be like me trying to explain HTTP or HTTPS. We don't really understand it on that deeper level to begin with, right? All we know is that, hey, I send a request and I can respond to that. It's basically the same thing in this case. Yeah. All right, cool. So let me get these guys running so that we can actually see how this is working. So we'll go npm start. Let me go back to my other terminal so we can start our server. Nodemon. Okay, and then I'm going to open up my terminal here because we're expecting some kind of a console log. Still trying to get the React app loading though. Okay, so see here, we've actually gotten this console log here saying thanks for coming. And then if I go back to my, oh, I forgot a space here. So this was us logging out the actual socket that just connected to us. You guys can see that this is an enormous object here that has a ton of different things in it. Oops. okay? So the socket is this large object, and we also have something inside here. There is a socket ID. I'm just trying to find it here. Goodness. There's the ID right here. Okay? So that ID is a unique generated ID, but it's also going to change every single time I refresh the page. So if I were to do a hard refresh on the client side, it would give me back a new client ID, or socket ID, I should say. Okay, and then I'm just going to change this here so that actually looks right. And then we can also do one other thing. We can, let me stop console logging this. We'll just console log the socket ID for now. Okay, so we can also do this. We can also listen for a disconnect event. So I can say socket.on disconnect. Say what I want to do is I want to decrease my number of connected clients. So this would be a callback function as well. We'll say connected clients decremented, right? If I can spell that. And then let's do another console log. So I'll just take this, drop that down here. Okay, so right now we have one connected. And if I were to close this window, we now have 0 connected, right? Okay, now it's saying that I have one connected again. So notice how the client ID has changed, right? So after I disconnected and reconnected, the client ID is something new. Okay, so that's one person. What if I wanted to connect somebody else? Well, a good way of testing connecting an additional person is opening up an incognito window here. And then let me open up the console tools down here. Okay, so I still got my little thanks for coming welcome message here. And now I have 2 clients connected, right? This is the first ID, and this is the second ID of my incognito browser. Is it important to link the socket.id to a specific user? How about using IP address? Yeah, you could potentially grab that IP address and do it that way, just in the sense that, hey, I'm listening for, I know somebody might refresh the page, meaning that the socket is going to reconnect. So yeah, if you have some way of identifying them, linking it to the socket ID to a specific user, Albert, is a little bit problematic in the sense that, what if I link them to an ID and then they refresh the page? That ID is going to change, right? Yeah. So maybe the IP address might be a little bit safer. You could definitely create an object of things, like if you were taking in somebody's name, you could use your own kind of thing, which is creating some unique keys for you, something like that. Is this the JWT? Yeah, you could create a JWT. Sure. It's a possibility. All right. So we did a lot though this morning. What I want to do is just kind of go through our code and make sure that we understand what it's doing. All we're doing right now is we're just sort of like ping-ponging from the server to the client side. So there's not really a lot going on. because in the afternoon, I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting where we're actually showing something on the screen. But I just wanted to get us all connected up and sort of seeing how this process is working. So let me ditch the terminal here, and let's just kind of go through this a little bit. Albert, take us through this first part here. So from lines 1 through 9.
These are the imports, setting the const variable express to import express through the require function.
Okay, well,
same for the
we're actually setting it to the result of invoking the express function.
Okay, that is correct. And we are calling the express function and setting the result of that to the const variable app.
Good.
We are same idea with app.listen, listening at port 4000, setting the result of that to be the const variable server.
Good.
And const.io is the result of the require function on socket.io, putting the server, which we instantiated on line 5, as an argument. Is that correct?
What we could do, just to make this a little bit more clear too, we could also separate this out a little bit. So I could say, let's just say const socket.io equals require socket.io, like that. And now just invoke that function, right?
Okay. So that was somewhat
Is that a little bit more clear, kind of what's going on now?
Yeah, so okay, so that was on the right track what I said. And yeah, I think that's all that you asked me to do.
Yeah, so when we require socket.io, we're getting back this function. And then on line 8, we're now invoking that function against our server.
And the result of that will be set to the const.io.
Will be set to the const variable IO. Okay, and then on line 10, what are we doing?
This is just pretty much a variable to keep track of how many sockets are connected, or client-side sockets are connected.
Exactly. All right, well done. Cool. Aya, can you take us through some of this here? Maybe up through those guys.
Okay. So you're calling the dot on function.
Yes.
And then you're passing in a string connection with the first argument. And then the next
Okay, do we know what that means? I want to make sure that everyone kind of gets a sense for what this means.
That when a client connects.
Yeah, so we can think of this on as we're adding an event listener. Sort of like we were doing before where we'd say add event listener, and then we would pass in a string that would say we were listening for a click event, right? So we're saying specifically we're listening for a connection event.
Okay.
Good,
So we
and then the second argument is what?
We would always use connection, right? Like when we're looking for connection, we can't just use our own string that we make up.
Right, we're not actually defining this connection event. That's something that's built into socket.io.
Okay, I understand. All right, and then the second argument is a callback. The callback takes in the socket as an argument. And then inside the body, you first console log the socket.id. So the ID of the client that just connected.
Right.
And then you implement connected clients to keep track of how many people are connected. And after that, you console log how many people are connected. And then after that, for socket.emit, that's what's a welcome message. That's something you do when someone connects.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So this welcome right here is an event that we are making up. I made up the name for that, and I said I want to pass along this data when we emit that event. Okay, so I'm gonna pass it along to the client so that it has that data.
Okay.
Can you clarify what the emit function means? Yeah, so what emit is doing is we're specifically passing back an event to the client side. In this case, we're doing socket.emit, which means that we're emitting that event directly to this specific socket that just connected to us. How does it know to trigger the event? Well, because we are specifically invoking this function right here, right? We're directly triggering it here. Yeah, so inside the io.on, once we've connected, we're saying, hey, we want to actually invoke this emit function, which will then trigger that event to happen on the client side. Any other noteworthy events? Besides connection and disconnect, those are the main ones, like .on or connection. Yeah, those are the main ones. Any other events that we're going to work with are typically going to be ones that we're creating for our particular application's needs. Yeah. Okay, solid. Let's come down here. Francis, take us through this socket.on.
So we have the dot on. I suppose it's that one. I'm still a little not clear on that one. The socket dot on.
So whenever we say .on, think of
Uh-huh.
that as we're adding some kind of an event listener. We're saying
Okay.
on this specific socket, when there's a disconnect event, I want to run this callback function.
Okay.
So when
Right.
that socket disconnects from me.
So yeah. I mean, I guess from what I saw earlier, that it does is that once we have this callback function, it just when someone disconnects from when a socket disconnects, then it just decrements the connected clients that we set earlier above, and then after that we just console log we have, and then however many connected clients there still are, and then we just have that and then connected.
Yeah, so we can even get sad about this, right? We could say someone just left ... sad face. What a bummer. Click off.
No.
Yeah. All right. Do you feel a little better about this though, that we're just adding an event listener again?
Yeah, I didn't realize that when you I guess call the function dot on, that's basically just an event listener.
Just an event listener, yeah. We're listening for that disconnect event, and then we're going to run this callback function when it happens.
Sounds good.
Okay,
Sounds
cool.
good. Cool.
All right. Solid. So Prativa, go ahead and do lines 3 and 6.
And 6. So in line 3, we are importing IO from socket.io client that is presented in node modules. In line 6, we are using the use state, and we are declaring the variable so that we can have this socket there. And we are inside the use state, we are passing the callback function where the socket is being listened at 4000 for.
Yeah, so what this is doing is the IO function is going to create the socket for us, and then we're specifying what port is our backend running on, right? Now, if I invoked it directly instead of passing the callback function, do you remember what problem that would cause?
It will re-invoke it, and it will we want to render it only one time. That's why we are using the callback function.
Well, yeah, so the component may actually re-render multiple times depending on if we change some state inside of it. But if I were to change the state and then we would come back here and re-invoke that IO function, that would cause all kinds of trouble, right? We would be creating brand new sockets every single time.
Okay.
We only want to create one socket per client, though. That's the important thing. Okay. Albert had a question about on the server side here. He was just asking, why are we saying socket.on inside this other callback function? And what I was saying is the reason why we have to do it in there is because we only have access to this socket inside this callback function. I can't just come out here and say socket.on because I don't have a socket in this scope, right? Yeah, exactly. So the entire time that the socket is connected, this is where your code is going to happen inside there. So that's where we have access to the socket itself. I have no access to it out here on line 26. Okay. Okay, cool. What else are we going to do? Let's do our use effect. Lawrence, you're up, my man. Tell us what's happening with this use effect here.
The use effect, like, so that's the callback function. So when the first time we run it, we have every single time for the page, we're gonna have this socket.on, like event list, event listener. It's like they're gonna show welcome, so they're gonna show the console.log welcome.
Wait, are you saying, Lawrence, that this is going to happen every single time the component re-renders? It's going to keep doing this?
No, when the socket change.
Okay, yeah,
we're gonna
exactly.
change,
So if this ever changes,
so just run one time.
yeah, and this should never change, right? We're only trying to create one socket. We want to make sure that that variable does not change. Why do we have socket in the socket if we only want socket to load once? Well, because if I take it out of here, React is going to complain to me. It's going to say something like, you're calling on socket inside this use effect callback, but you did not declare it in your array of dependencies down here. So it'll say something like either add it to the array of dependencies or don't use it at all. And in my opinion, it should be okay to just add it to the dependencies array because, again, this object is not going to change. We're only going to create it one time. Yeah. Okay, cool. So what was happening here, Lawrence? I think I sort of missed what you were saying there.
So this is a like event listener. So
right,
when we render this component, whatever app, so the first time they're gonna send a console.log message welcome.
Yeah, so let's be kind of a little bit more explicit about here. What this is saying is that the very first time this component loads, we're going to add an event listener for this event, for an event called welcome. So when I get something from the server, an event called welcome, I'm just going to console log whatever the data that came along with that event was. Okay? We're adding this event listener one time. We don't want to add it multiple times, obviously. So that's why we have it inside this use effect call. Yeah, so the welcome that we defined on the server is what we're listening for, exactly. And this is kind of a key point too, which is that if I had a bunch of different clients connected to my server at the same time, those clients can't communicate directly with one another. They can only go through the server. Okay. So it's sort of like everything's connected to the server, but all those individual clients can't communicate directly with one another. All right. And then what were we doing here, Lawrence?
And we will return a callback function whenever we left this page.
Exactly. So if at any point in time our app component becomes unmounted, we want to actually disconnect that socket. Okay. And as I was telling you guys, it's not really as critical that we do this if we're inside the app component, because the app component's never going to be unmounted. But if you guys are doing your sockets in some other subcomponent, you will want to do this. You'll want to return this cleanup function. And when you guys are looking at the lesson in the platform too, I added some further reading on that. You could just click the link. It'll take you to the React docs about how these cleanup functions work. All right, I think that's it for now. Can I have thumbs on this, guys? Good. All right, Aya. Yeah. Lawrence feels pretty good. Albert, Aya. Any clarifications I can do right now, Albert or Aya? Or do you want to just marinate on it? It's the execution. Yeah, of course. I can wait for afternoon. Okay, that's fine. Okay, cool. Let me stop the share here. Stop the